So just about everyone knew that something was very amiss with Ashes of Creation after it collapsed alongside its studio just 2 weeks after launch. And now we're starting to get reports and testimonials from investors involved. And if all of that information is true, this is all far worse than we could have possibly imagined. So I'm going to give you the TLDR versions right here, summarized by a couple individuals. Jay Oddity tweeted the following recently: Ashes of Creation drama goes nuclear as the new owners sue Stephen J. Sharif. In the lawsuit, they claim Stephen was, and for those who don't know, Stephen Sharif is the creative director of Ashes of Creation and the individual who spearheaded the entire project. The lawsuit claims that Stephen was effectively embezzling funds, taking money from investors for his own use, mixing business and personal funds, bought a property with Intrepid's funds, but when sold, personally kept the money, used loans as revenue to get bigger loans. This is all obviously just allegations at the moment and are not proven. The lawsuit is TFE Game Holdings versus Stephen J. Sharif and John Moore. Another bombshell happened when an Ashes of Creation investor, Jason Karamanis, spoke with YouTuber NephesQS. He appeared to share private texts and conversations surrounding the game. The texts appear to show many years of Stephen and Jason talking with Stephen, appearing to somewhat love bomb Jason when asking for investment. We await Stephen's side of the story, but this all seems incredibly messy at the moment. One investor is said to have lost upwards of $90 million. And then here's another one that is a little longer, but provides even more details about what we're learning based on recent reports. Okay, says One Peg, let me get this straight. Ashes of Creation former CEO Stephen Sharif bankrupted the company on purpose after 10 years having not put a single dollar into his company. One of the claims to fame for Ashes of Creation is the fact that, according to Stephen Sharif back then, it was solely being funded by Kickstarter and him and his own personal funds. As it turns out, based on what investors are saying, none of that would turn out to be true, looking at all the financial information that's been leaked. The tweet continues, Ashes of Creation was spending $2.5 million per month in burn in 2025, and $1 million per year was salaries to himself and his husband throughout the duration of the project. But he wasn't keeping up with his mortgage on his home and was at risk of having the bank foreclose on his house. And it wasn't just any old regular house, it was a freaking mansion. And almost losing his house, Stephen begged his two primary investors for money to secure a loan that he couldn't pay and put $1.3 million into an escrow account for his home loan. When Ashes of Creation's track record of insolvency wasn't improving, insolvency meaning its inability to pay a debt, the primary investor of Intrepid, who paid $80 million, said he was taking over and tried to make Stephen the creative director with an earn-out plan. They were to lay off 50 to 70% of the staff, but at least save the game and business. Stephen refused. When negotiations failed, Stephen notified the bank holding his home loan of the incoming Steam funds from the early access launch and instructed them to write a letter to Valve claiming the $3.7 million of sales money. This did three things. Number one, it technically fulfilled the obligation of launching the game to backers. Referring to this promise in the Kickstarter campaign, in the case that Ashes of Creation does not launch, we promise to refund all backers in full. And the promise was that Stephen Sharif had personal funds aside specifically meant to refund Kickstarter backers in case Ashes of Creation does not launch. It technically did launch now in early access in a woefully unfinished state, so he can now say that this promise was technically fulfilled. Stephen can now say he doesn't owe anyone refunds because the game did launch, which puts the early access launch in a negative light. It doesn't seem like it was about trying to release a version of the game that was still viable and get feedback from users. It felt like the early access was rushed out to fulfill this promise amidst this entire situation of Stephen Sharif seemingly scamming the community as well as the investors involved in Ashes of Creation and also the developers he hired to work on this game who poured their hearts into it. So that's one of the things Stephen's alleged deception did. Number two, Securing the funds released the $1.3 million from escrow of personal money that the bank was holding to secure his home loan. And then number 3, if this part's true, like this is just evil shit. That money was intended to pay payroll on February 1st. When the money vaporized due to the bank's claim they had no choice but to close the business and send out warrant notifications, that's why it came so late. Steven's unethical board, referring to the statement he released after everything collapsed, or he talked about how he resigned because of an unethical board and how he disagreed with their decisions, was him refusing to take a step away from the control seat. The letter to the bank bankrupted the company. Steven Sharif literally caused Intrepid Studios and Ashes of Creation to burn by his own hand and walked away from the business with literal millions of dollars in his bank account. Holy fuck. If you would like the full story in complete detail, then you owe it to yourself to watch Nefes QS's videos here. There were 2 of them that he released. One of them titled, Investor Claims Steven and His Husband Embezzled Millions to Fund Party Life. And the second video right here is titled, Steven Sharif's Worst Nightmare Comes True. The first video is 1 hour and 19 minutes and 41 seconds long. The second one is 1 hour and 43 minutes and 57 minutes long. Yeah, there is a lot of information to go through, but what these videos do is not only highlight the individuals who are accusing Steven Sharif of essentially fraud, in particular one investor who decided to leak all this information to provide evidence. These videos also present the actual receipts to ensure that, these claims aren't unsubstantiated. The description of these videos, the first one here reads, exclusive bombshell report. I've obtained private legal and financial documents from a primary Ashes of Creation investor who I met with through video calls and emails after confirming their identity. The documents detail a debt of over $150 million with over 380 pages of text messages exchanged between Steven Sharif and the investor that gives us a better timeline of what may have happened behind the scenes at Intrepid Studios from 2014, 3 years before the Kickstarter even launched, to 2026. In the second video, that's 1 hour and 43 minutes and 57 seconds long, Jason speaks directly with Nefes QS. The second video right here is actually a direct interview with Jason Karamenis, and this video's description reads, after obtaining private legal and financial documents from a primary Ashes of Creation investor, he calls us while we're live streaming to give us further details on how Steven Sharif, CEO of Intrepid Studios, stole the payroll from employees. He also details how Steven actually quote-unquote resigned and answers people's questions. If you want the most detailed summary and account of these 2 videos, WCCF Tech here did a tremendous job with the following article titled, Ashes of Creation Investor Alleges Founder Orchestrated a $140 million fraud. And scrolling down here, you can see that this article kind of presents the entire timeline in full detail. All of the investors involved, all of the investors who felt like they were screwed over, all of Steven Sharif's actions that resulted in the downfall, in the collapse of Ashes of Creation, as well as Intrepid Studios as a whole, his selfish actions, his manipulations, and straight up, him stealing money and engaging in what looks to be almost like embezzlement, as well as straight up running with money invested by investors who believed in Steven Sharif's promise in an MMORPG project that would redefine the genre, that would garner a huge fan base, and that would make these investors a lot of money. It's also worth noting that all of this completely contradicts what Steven Sharif has consistently touted throughout the years of Ashes of Creation's development, which was that it was completely self-funded and that, according to this statement right here, directly from Steven, we aren't governed by greedy corporate overlords. I'm funding the project, so no investors or a board to answer to, no publishers to appease. We speak with, not to, our community, and we actually listen to feedback and value and respect our players. As it turns out, there were, in fact, investors. There was some kind of board to answer to, and that would be these investors that Steven kind of dragged by the nose for the longest time before jumping ship when Steven himself allegedly sunk the ship in order to be able to get away with millions in money. And Steven claims right here, I'm funding the project. And this isn't the only time Steven claimed this. He very publicly stated so via the following interview from July 18th, 2018 with news outlet PC Games N. When asked about how this game is being funded, he straight up said that the vast majority of the project has been paid for personally by the CEO. But based on what investors' testimonials and documentations reveal, he didn't put a single penny personally into this project. That apparently was a complete and utter lie. People believed in Steven Sharif because he was involved with this company called Zango, who engages in multi-level marketing. Apparently, he made millions off of that. And one of the biggest concerns surrounding this project was the fact that the creative director was involved in multi-level marketing, which is often considered to be a really controversial way of doing business. It's seen as basically pyramid scheme-esque. It is deemed to be in many ways like a scam, or at least a very scummy and manipulative and deceptive way of doing business. So that history alone kind of cropping up early on when the Kickstarter campaign launched gave people a lot of pause and made people very suspicious about this project. And the funny part about all of this is that PC Gamer called it all the way back in June of 2017 in this article titled, "There's Something Strange About Kickstarter's Most Successful MMO." This was after Ashes of Creation's Kickstarter campaign launched on May 1st, 2017, and after it became the most successful Kickstarter MMO, with a campaign having earned over $3.2 million from almost 20,000 backers, and would also earn more money thereafter. Among the things that PC Gamer highlighted was the fact that Steven Sharif was involved with multi-level marketing, and PC Gamer aptly highlights here that the multi-level marketing industry is one embroiled in controversy and skepticism. Around this time, Steven Sharif was also asked, why turn to Kickstarter if you're so rich that you can fund this MMO yourself? To which he said that Kickstarter is a very small supplemental source to increase the scope of our project and hire additional personnel. Except Steven Sharif, based on recent documentation and based on recent testimonials, never had any intention of investing a single cent of his own personal funds into the project. So with all that context, what this Kickstarter looks like is just a means to earn more money, to scam people out of money. PC Gamer back then also raised suspicions surrounding the promise that if Ashes of Creation doesn't launch, then Steven Sharif would refund every donation in full. PC Gamer understandably expressed that they were skeptical of such a claim, seeing as that Kickstarter money would already be spent on salaries and development by the time the game failed. But what Steven Sharif claimed at the time is that the entirety of the budget comes from my personal funding, the entirety of the budget for refunds, stating that those reserves are available to refund the people who pledged towards it. Basically insinuating that Steven Sharif would personally refund all Kickstarter backers if Ashes of Creation fails. And if all of this is to be believed, then we know for sure that the reason the early access came out the way it did, in the completely woefully unfinished state that it did, wasn't because he wanted to get feedback from players. This was just a rushed out product to fulfill that promise so that Steven Sharif would not have to live up to that promise of refunding everyone. The early access currently seems like it was just a means to avoid having to pay people from his own personal funds as he originally promised. And then there's the controversial referral program that Ashes of Creation engaged in way back then that basically gave individuals referral codes, and if they were able to invite other people to fund Ashes of Creation, it would earn the referrer 15% of that value back as premium credits or actual cash when the game is live, which basically actively incentivized people to hype up and spread word about a game that doesn't even exist yet. And all this, by the way, was against Kickstarter's own policies, with Kickstarter, after having been reached out to by PC Gamers, stating that we do not allow revenue or profit sharing. And all of this felt very reminiscent of Steven Sharif's multi-level marketing background. And with all these reports, testimonials, and documentation coming out from investors who felt like they were scammed, this PC Gamer article now looks incredibly prophetic. If all these claims are true, then it would seem as though every red flag that people brought up and that brought a lot of suspicions surrounding this entire project were incredibly warranted. Many people fear that Stephen Sharif was actually a huge scammer based on his multi-level marketing background, and based on these recent reports, if true, it seemed as though there's a good reason why he succeeded in the multi-level marketing business. It may very well be that for Stephen Sharif, this entire thing was basically a long con. And I mean, when you look at all of the contradictions, the fact that there are these major investors at all, when Stephen Sharif consistently stated that there are no investors in this project whatsoever, that there's complete autonomy here, that Stephen Sharif himself is funding this project, when there's evidence potentially that Stephen Sharif did not invest a single dollar into this project, that alone already casts an incredibly suspicious light on Stephen Sharif. But then investors being as adamant as they are and presenting all of the documentation and all of the messages, the text messages that they exchanged, and all of it highlighting like seemingly very clear evidence of full-on like fraud, one of the biggest and most egregious cases of fraud in gaming history. Yeah, none of this looks good for Stephen Sharif. We still have to hear Stephen Sharif's side of the story to get the full picture, but it's hard to know if his word can be trusted or if he can provide documentation himself to contradict what investors are presenting. But again, the existence of these investors at all already makes Stephen Sharif look like he cannot be trusted, because it means he practically completely lied to the community and to the public and to journalists. From the May 1st, 2017 Kickstarter campaign launch, it would take almost 9 years to launch the early access version of Ashes of Creation, which would release on December 11th, 2025 for $50 that a lot of people paid for. You can see right here, based on recent developments, recent reviews have turned overwhelmingly negative with the collapse of the game, with the collapse of the studio, and with all of this seemingly looking like one giant long con. At one point, amidst the collapse of the studio and the game, Stephen tried to present himself as a victim, and all of this putting out the following statement back in, January 31st, 2026. I can make a limited statement in my personal capacity and not on behalf of the company regarding the situation. Control of the company shifted away from me, and the board began directing actions that I could not ethically agree with or carry out. As a result, I chose to resign and protest rather than lend my name or authority to decisions I could not ethically support. Following my resignation, much of the senior leadership team resigned. Following those departures, the board made the decision to issue WARN Act notices and proceed with a mass layoff. I cannot responsibly speak to further details at this time due to ongoing legal and governance matters. What I can say is that the developers and staff acted in good faith and deserve better than the uncertainty they're now facing. I'm incredibly dismayed by the situation, claims Stephen Sharif. But all of this is cast under an immense amount of suspicion, and there's suddenly a new perspective we can look at this statement with if we consider all of the claims and all of the accusations against Stephen Sharif. So now we know that the board is actually the investors who were deeply involved in Ashes of Creation, despite the fact that Stephen consistently claimed that there is no board of directors, there are no investors. Resigning in protest to decisions that he could not ethically support, it seemed as though that's related to investors finally putting their foot down and forcing Stephen Sharif to make decisions to save the game and the business. It reads right here, by January 2026, Robert Dawson had reached his breaking point. Having invested $80 million with no return and facing continued operational losses, he initiated what Karamanis describes as a reasonable restructuring plan. The proposal called for a 60 to 70% staff layoffs to make the company financially sustainable, a new funding round requiring all existing investors to contribute 25% of their previous investment to maintain equity, and a new role for Sharif as creative director with earnout-based equity tied to company performance rather than immediate ownership. This is what Stephen Sharif protested, what he couldn't ethically agree to, which is why Stephen Sharif flat out refused. Karamanis revealed that he demanded immediate equity despite having contributed no capital. When negotiations failed, Sharif allegedly took action that would destroy the company entirely. And that's when he decided to resign outright. Between approximately January 26th and January 31st, Sharif resigned as creative director and executed what Karametis called an act of sabotage. He had Commerce Bank send a letter to Valve claiming the Steam revenue from the December early access launch, approximately $3.7 million that had been earmarked for the February 1st payroll. This money was instead used to pay off Commerce Bank's loan secured by Sharif's house or Sharif's mansion, releasing $1.5 to $1.6 million in escrow to him personally. The seizure of funds left the company unable to make payroll and effectively bankrupted it. Karametis portrays Steven's seizure of the Steam revenue as a deliberate act of sabotage, thus destroying the company rather than accepting the performance-based compensation proposed by main investor Robert Dawson. He basically stole money from the company that was meant to be used for payroll and paid off his mansion instead. That's the accusation right here. And again, if true, holy fucking shit. And not to mention that he preferred to destroy the company, to destroy the game and the community instead of accepting a performance-based compensation method proposed by Robert Dawson. Because then he'd actually be held responsible and liable, and he couldn't just use company funds willy-nilly. He couldn't just extract money how he wanted. That's why he destroyed everything. For money. And if you saw my previous reportings on this whole situation, you will know that the Warren Act letter indicated that recent payroll period cannot be met by Intrepid Studios. And allegedly, it wasn't because Steven Sharif didn't have the means to actually pay payroll. It was because he decided to use that money for his own purposes, for his own personal needs, to pay off his own personal mansion. But yeah, I mean, I would highly recommend reading through this entire article to get the full timeline of events, to get the real specifics, including all of the investors and parties involved who felt like they were frauded. Now, it's worth highlighting that a lot of the people that Steven Sharif received investment fund were themselves multi-level marketing entrepreneurs. Jason Karametis himself is a 57-year-old multi-level marketing entrepreneur who made his fortune primarily through Junice Global, a Florida-based anti-aging skincare and supplements multi-level marketing company where he achieved the rank of Imperial Diamond Director. Ugh. And alongside that, he also joined other multi-level marketing companies over the years, and in the video acknowledges being at the top of the pyramids. Like, yeah, MLM is practically another form of pyramid scheme. And with Karametis in particular, he apparently invested, or rather lost now, $12.5 million of his own money by investing in Ashes of Creation and believing in Sharif's empty promises. And Steven Sharif himself not only never invested a single penny into Intrepid Studios, despite publicly claiming having contributed between $30 to $60 million over the years, but beyond that, he actually took money from the company, with him and his partner John Moore consistently and systematically having withdrawn $500,000 per year in salary payments. As a couple, Steven Sharif and John Moore took $1 million a year from the company and just gave it to themselves. The article further details here that while the public report suggested the company had raised between $109 million and $115 million, Karametis claims that the actual figure approaches $140 million when accounting for Kickstarter funds, Commerce Bank loans, PPP loans, and various private investments, all of whom were completely screwed over and blindsided by this. This is a $140 million fraud case if all of these accusations turn out to be true. Now, another investor is Tom Alkazin, who invested $2 million, much of it which was earned through MLM, or multi-level marketing. So Steven Sharif got a lot of his multi-level marketing folks and people who got rich off of that to invest in his seemingly scheme. Apparently, at one point, this investor, Alkazin, settled with the Federal Trade Commission to pay $1.2 million, with a larger judgment of over $6.7 million partially suspended, alongside a forfeiture of 1.61 acres in San Marcos, California. Alkazin was also permanently banned from engaging in pyramid schemes and any future multi-level marketing activities. So it seemed as though Alcazin himself was found guilty of basically being a schemer, like a con artist, basically. Again, it just feels like Steven Sharif was like the ultimate con artist and took advantage of other con artists. But yeah, apparently the $2 million that Tom Alcazin invested, a 70-something family friend, apparently that was basically the life savings of Tom Alcazin and his wife. So even among schemers and con artists, it seemed as though Steven Sharif is like a level above, just far more ruthless than the rest of them. Now, the single largest victim is this individual who I spoke about before, Robert Dawson, who invested approximately $80 million of his own capital into the failing company, a wealthy investor whom Karamanis introduced to Sharif several years ago in Las Vegas. So that's potentially $80 million down the drain as a result of Steven Sharif's actions, which based on reports seem to have been very calculated and intentional in many regards. But yeah, there's talks here about Sharif allegedly refusing to provide books and records, tax returns, or QuickBooks files for 9 years, which is indeed very suspicious. How he never attended or called for a single board meeting. There's information here about Steven Sharif allegedly purchasing a mansion, and in 2024, when the original owner's mortgage came due, that was like a crisis point, and so he turned to his investors once more to basically bail him out of his debt. All the while in 2025, Intrepid Studios was hemorrhaging cash because operating expenses were at a whopping $2.5 million per month, and the game was only making $150,000 to $200,000 per month after it launched. So that's a monthly loss of around $2.3 million per month, just a ridiculous burn rate. Even Dawson's massive capital infusions couldn't sustain the operation indefinitely because of how fast the burn rate was. The end result is investors talking about how there's all this money that was lost that they'll never get back, with some folks like Alcazin losing their entire life savings, with Karamanis admitting that he's cried himself at night alongside Dawson because of the sheer amount of money that they lost and how betrayed they felt. But personally, the people I most feel for are the Kickstarter backers who invested not only money, but also their time and their emotional investment. And I also feel bad for the developers who genuinely believed in this project and who did their best to work under the circumstances that they were given, only for them to be laid off and also not be paid for their work, with a former developer here highlighting how none of the people who were laid off are receiving our final paychecks, the 60 days notice and pay outlined under the WARN Act, PTO payouts or paid time off payouts, or other compensation owed. They were especially screwed over. They were made to believe in this dream only for the rug to be pulled from under them, and underneath it all seemingly was just pure deception and complete fraud and malfeasance. As for what the future holds, well, it should come as no surprise that multiple lawsuits are reportedly imminent, with involved parties including TFE Games, which invested $5 million, Commerce Bank, which Karamanis claims was defrauded with false revenue reports, and numerous other investors, with claims that Karamanis alleges that Sharif committed federal crimes by booking investor loans as revenue on tax returns. Karamanis went as far as to say that there is nothing I'm saying that is slanderous or libelous about Stephen, which is why he's presenting all of the documentation and evidence that he is. Karamanis claims he's a pathological nutcase liar, and guess what? You're going to see numerous lawsuits come out against him for fraud, for whatever else. All this is going to come out in litigation. Karamanis also says that people should look up what narcissistic personality disorder is, because apparently it describes Steven Sharif to a T. He's the most narcissistic tool I've ever met in my entire life, says Karamanis. As for Ashes of Creation itself, apparently Robert Dawson now controls the Ashes of Creation intellectual property, the investor who put in $80 million into this project. And apparently Dawson is exploring options to continue developing Ashes of Creation, but understandably, key technical staff allegedly refused to communicate with him, having been poisoned against investors by Sharif, claimed Karamanis. Yeah, I mean, the people involved are also multi-level marketers and rich people who you cannot really trust. They're in it for the money. So it's hard for developers to put their trust in this project ever again. How could they? And with all the negative press surrounding it, there's absolutely no way anyone will want to touch this. I think there is no future for Ashes of Creation personally. I would also recommend checking out this article right here by massivelyoverpowered.com or massivelyop.com that provides a summary of the first video that Nefis QS published. It adds further context about this other investor, this Chinese company, iDream Sky, which was meant to invest $60 million over 5 years with a 35% revenue share in 2019, but then out of the blue, they just kind of pulled out, and it allegedly put Karametis himself into debt and had Sharif scrambling to even fund payroll for developers for multiple months. The debt accrued by Intrepid totals over $105 million, though, as previously reported, Karametis says it's closer to $140 million. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it there, folks. I could literally sit here and detail all of this for hours. But again, if you want all of the nitty-gritty details, go to these two videos by NephisQS 1 and 2, and also look at these two articles right here, this one from Massively Overpowered and this one from WCCF Tech, all of which I will link in the description section below. In the meantime, though, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on this whole situation. I think this is one of the most insane, one of the most egregious cases of fraud, if not the most egregious case of fraud I've ever witnessed in my time covering video games. That is, of course, assuming any of this is true. We haven't heard from Steven Sharif yet, but I think his silence currently is speaking very loudly. And if he does have evidence to provide to contradict all the accusations against him, he has to present those sooner rather than later, because right now, Steven Sharif looks, like one of the most evil people to have ever touched the gaming industry. But that's my take. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.